Well, that's quite providential that we're on International Inuit Day,
Yeah,
right?
it's exciting.
It is exciting.
I woke up this morning and I saw that and I was like, oh, we're
Oh,
celebrating us today.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Jolene and I met during my academic journey, and I was taking a cross-cultural class, and I reached out to you,
Mm-hmm.
and we've known each other since you were little and sweet in a pew of a church or
Yeah.
something. I think our parents
Yeah.
went to the same church.
Yeah.
Um, so I knew of you that way, and I'd always loved your mom, but we drifted apart and then reconnected last year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
That
really
was cool.
Yeah, but first tell us about what you brought.
I brought you some things that I wanted to show you for International Inuit Day. I showed you our ukpik, which is like rabbit fur or sealskin.
Mm-hmm.
You'll see all different styles, but growing up as a little girl, I always remember ours to be sort of like this boxy shape.
Yeah.
You'll see other ukpik that have like wings and they're tinier and the legs are more distinct, but ours are just like these, rectangle shapes and with eyes. They could have beaded eyes and usually leather beak and then maybe leather little feet. Yeah.
And they feel good. They're the rabbit skin
and it smells so good.
yeah.
Every time I think about my mom because, growing up, I had that. And now I look back and I realize how lucky I was to have what I did from my mom, what she had. So she had her artwork, which was profound. Yeah. Always saw those sort of landscapes, those faces on the wall, wolves or polar bear, those facets of our culture. So I grew up very influenced by that art, which is a very profound thing. I realize that now. So, but there was other things. My auntie had sewed me an adikuk, so I had my own little tiny parka as a little girl. Yeah. She was a master seamstress. She learned from my grandmother. My grandmother was an incredible seamstress. Yeah. There's so much. I just said to my husband today, I actually said to him, I said, all those powerful hunters and those whalers and those powerful men out on the land would have been nothing without the clothing that the women were making. That's those seamstresses. Yeah. And that level of skill of making clothes to be able to survive out on the land. So I had that as a little girl. I had the artwork, and my mom would tell me stories sometimes before bed. She would talk about, the land a lot to me. So I grew up in this, predominantly non-Indigenous community in a very, colonized way of thinking as well. Right. So
but the art was speaking to you.
But there was, but there was little, aspects of our culture that remained. Yeah. I remember that. And now I know how much influence that had on me. Yeah. Okay, so I was like the only little Inuk kid in my school. Okay, and then, but I knew that I was different, and I was always proud of my heritage. It wasn't until later that the problems would arise around identity and that. Okay. However, going back to like being a kid, it was like that impacted me in a very powerful way. So no matter what, my mom had carried these little bits and pieces of culture, words that I remember. So I actually know a fair bit of Inuvialuktun just from listening to my mom and my aunties and my grandmother talk. Yeah. So that's beautiful. So they kept that despite them going to residential school. So I also brought a few different styles of uluit. Uluit is like the plural way of saying ulu. Okay. So ulu is like a...
Yes, you're always correcting my plural.
Plural, yeah.
I know, that's so hard to get.
It is, but there's some pretty like simple resources that you can look at, especially when you're referring to Inuit. Yeah. So again, just for everybody, Inuit is plural. Right. So I would say I'm Inuk, but if I want to be more specific and tell you what kind of Inuk, I am Inuvialuk. Our people are Inuvialuit. So just kind of, it's just like English, like just think of the UIT. Okay. as being plural, and UK is singular. Yeah, that's pretty. So this one I actually was gifted to me. Beautiful. This is a Baffin Island, sort of more Eastern Arctic style of ulu. Yeah, absolutely. So this is was gifted to me last year when I was in H.E.A.L camp. Isn't it so beautiful? She gifted it to me after we left the H.E.A.L camp. Okay. I told you when we met up last year that I got to go to my homelands last year, and I had no idea that I was going to be on my own family's fish camp. Yeah. So I learned how to use them properly when I was in fish camp. We were cutting fish. And so I did try this style, but I accelerated in cutting fish when I tried this style. Okay. So this is unique to our region. So this is a clavic. This was actually made in a clavic, and my tattoo artist gifted this to me.
Okay. And what's the handle made of?
So this must be, it is some kind of antler, right. I believe. Or no, wait, no, sorry. Like. Maybe, yeah, this could be some sort of that's definitely either bone, antler, or tusk. This is, she said, caribou antler. Okay. So this style, although it seems a lot bigger and bulkier, it flowed when I was cutting the fish. Yeah. You can feel when when you use ulu, you're actually like, forget everything that you learned about safety when using knives. Okay. You're cutting like this, your hand is right by the blade. Okay. So when I was first learning how, you had all these little tiny nicks on your fingers just where you hit by accident. But because you're working so closely with this fish, you could feel the ribs. You could feel the blade sliding over the ribs, and I just closed my eyes, and I could do it with my eyes closed because as long as I could feel those ribs. And then you peel it back. So we were making pipsy, which is like a wind-dried and smoked fish. Okay. Yeah, it's so good. And then I brought this just to show you. This is probably just made. These are both handmade, but this one is probably, just, this doesn't look so handmade. But the style, this is a typical Alaskan style. Okay. So my grandfather was Alaskan. Okay. So... But these are women's knives. I just wanted to point out that these are women's knives. So men traditionally wouldn't have used these at all. Yeah. So I just thought I'd show you those are neat things. Yeah, because, I'm taking my degree in Indigenous governance, and I've taken some self-determination courses with H.E.A.L University. We're talking about this stuff all the time, about our sovereignty and self-determination. And there's... maybe we could have a conversation one time about how cultural items have Indigenous governance, have meaning around Indigenous governance. I know sometimes it's hard to think of in that context, but when you think about, this like arcing blade of a woman's knife has more governance for me than does in the Canadian Constitution. Yes.
Well, and I think that's one of the things you've been really strong with me is helping me get there. Like when I start out, I might not have that connection. Yeah. But you're good at taking people there. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have more conversations. Yeah. Sounds good. So thank you for bringing this.
Absolutely.
This is cute. Can he just stay there?
He can stay there. Yeah.
Yeah, neat. So when we first met, I wanted to interview you for a cross-cultural. And I came from thinking I knew a bit. I mean, one of my little, I don't know if it's tokenism or not, but I'm married to a Métis man from, an Indigenous family. And I guess the curiosity and knowing him and his family. So I was coming at it, knowing more than I actually, or thinking I knew more than I actually knew. And you started adjusting my learning and directing my learning right off the hop. And I'm grateful for that. Cool. And I think that was part of it. So just to tell the listeners a little bit of that story, I'm like, hey, Jolene, can I interview you? And you started asking me questions. You were like, how is this going to benefit my people? What is the compensation arrangement? Do we have a relationship? Do we have a, and because I, like, as at that time, a psychologist in training, we're being trained in a colonialized system. Can't we just all admit that? And that's what it is. Yeah. And so we tend to approach things with this view that we just don't know. And I mean, we could go down a trail of being quite negative, but we could just know so much more.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was
absolutely.
Our very first encounter was just starting to get to that adjustment. And thankfully we got to the interview stage
Yeah.
and worked those out and gone
Yeah.
into other things. And that's the topic that I want to keep revisiting. And we're going to visit and talk. It's just like get Jolene talking. That's, we learn so much as soon as you get rolling.
Cool.
But that was the kind of what I came out of that with is when it comes to, in my professional life, an Indigenous climate, am I ever trained in a way that will not fit this therapeutic relationship? That I'm actually going to have to learn a lot and I'm going to have to shift a lot, and that my understanding of culture is I'm going to need to cross this to be able to have connection. And you were so great about sharing your stories of your meeting a counselor and some fortitude to finally get in a relationship that helped you because you had some serious mental health challenges. And when you were looking for help, it was being delivered in a way that was not a good fit for you or almost any Indigenous person.
Yeah.
And what I remember from the research doing my papers, an Indigenous person is more likely to have mental health challenges. And then you have the system that is more likely to not meet them because of the way we're trained.
And I just want to, add really quickly that it is also at times can be dangerous for us to access those mental health resources, especially when there's children involved. Yes. So I do recall one of the first times trying to access a counselor. I had to actually, they wanted to know, are you in a crisis? There was a specific question about crisis, and that word just, sent chills down my back. And I was like,
what are the implications of that?
And I was like, I can't say yes to this. I have this, at this point I had only had my one son, and we had a tumultuous birth and everything, Can
you just take us back up? Because this is where we want to be. And talk about that first need to reach out and just how it unfolded.
Well, I don't know how much I told you last year, but my son and I almost died when I gave birth to him. And so I was in the hospital for a long time after that. I've got a lot of memories just surrounding that. But, here I am having my first son, took him home finally after what felt like a really long time. Finally was able to go home, and we were living up a big ski resort, so it was really beautiful. I loved it. But there's not many people up there, come fall time. People are starting, we're isolated.
Postpartum likely.
Yeah. And my partner had to go back to work right away. He took off as much time as he could. So here I am with this little baby, and I realized when my last visitor left, I'll never forget when that glass door slid shut, and I realized that I was alone with my baby, and I felt so terrified that I packed him up in his car seat, and I went and I drove to my husband's work. I knew he'd be off work in a few hours, and I just sat waiting for him. And I was like... I was so scared, but Orion was sleeping. I wasn't able to nurse him. So I had bottles for him. I had the Jeep, so I felt safe in the Jeep. And then when Orion woke up, I would just feed him his formula. And then I waited for Dan to get off work. And so he got in, and then I was like, okay, I'm not alone, and I knew that I needed to get help at that point. I'd never accessed help, not to see a counselor in that way. Okay. But at this point we were looking, it was like, I need to go on antidepressants. There's a time and place for, these medicines. And I knew, I was like, I think something's wrong. I think something's wrong. And unfortunately, I waited way too long, and I was in a really, really terrifying place. And I always looked after Orion, though he was the one thing that was that seemed like, this little light that was in my day, and I knew I had to look after him. And even when he woke me up at 3:00 in the morning, I wasn't sleeping anyways. So, it was okay. I was like, at least he was hanging out with me. So we had this very, very close relationship. But I do remember the questions, they wanted me to see, it was not a psychologist, it was a psychiatrist.
Okay.
And I was very concerned about that.
So their assumption is you're reaching out for mental health help.
Yeah.
That you're a bad parent.
Something wasn't sitting right
Yeah.
with me. And I told you last year, my first experience with the counselor was, gosh, he was a young white male, that probably the same age as me.
Yeah.
And he did this funny little thing where he wrote as I was talking to him. We sat across from each other at a desk, kind of like that, sat across and just sat there and doodled or wrote down things as we were talking. And he did this like circular thing. And he was like, he wrote like, you know, Jolene. And then it was like, he's like, so from like listening to what you've been talking about, it sounds like, you know, you're missing your work and you're missing, friendships or whatever it was. And then he did this little circle thing. He said, it sounds like you just need to go and get a job and you'll feel better.
Wow.
Instead of be the stay-at-home. Yeah, this was my first experience. Yeah.
Let's unpack that. So you go see a young guy, a young non-Indigenous white guy, your own age. So culturally just so out of your wheelhouse.
Yeah.
Right, of what you need.
Yeah. And again, also myself at that time, that had only barely begun to develop. It wasn't until much more further into Orion's childhood that I really had to start addressing my own trauma and intergenerational trauma that up to this point, Devaney, I hadn't even thought of it. Yeah. So here you've got two people who are ignorant, and you're like, how come this isn't working? And I've got no idea.
And the solution is, if you go get a job, that you need to get out more.
I need to get out more and I need to get a job and my depression will go away.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So that was a miss.
Yeah, that was a miss.
Swing and a miss.
Safe to say. Yeah. I believe that I went on antidepressants though.
Okay. So
at that time. Yeah. So I did get a prescription. I have only been on them twice. Both times were very serious.
Yeah. And something about that helped you regain something to carry on.
There's right? I believe firmly in, yes, there are aspects of Western healing practices that are very necessary. And they took me from a place that felt terrifying and dangerous and scary to a place that I was like, okay, I feel like I've got capacity and that I'm not just at the very edge here. So I am an advocate for antidepressants when they're needed. However, it is not ever going to actually help you heal. It'll help you be able to function to heal, but it doesn't do the healing for you, right? It's not like you take this thing and that your trauma gets addressed and goes away. It's like, no, it just brings you, brings you to this place where you're like, okay, I think that I have some time now and I can actually start looking at my stuff.
Well, I think a lot of people need to hear that it's a tool.
It's a tool. Absolutely.
It's a tool, and
yes.
And it's available.
Yeah.
But it's risky for you as an Indigenous woman to access mental health. Tell us about that a little bit.
Well, I mean, so we get asked questions, I imagine that most people get asked these questions. Okay. So I'm not saying that just Native people get asked these, questions. Are you in a crisis? No, I'm sure that's all across the board. However, there's this lack of education around, how the ministry, typically here in Canada, the Ministry of Child and Family Development reacts and how with Indigenous parents. Okay. And this is systemic and this has been happening for a very long time and it's still happening today. Okay. So, automatically there's this layer of intersection, that we carry, and maybe, some non-Indigenous doctors or nurses, whoever, mental health care workers don't see that, or they don't understand that. They haven't given it any credence because they haven't had to,
right?
So and that's why we do the work that we do. That's why we're here, and that's why we're doing the work that we do, so that we can reduce these barriers. They want to have Indigenous women come and access these places like in town. Well, you need to fix your intake forms because this looks problematic. They're going to take one look at that and they're going to leave, because, Indigenous women and Indigenous parents are in a higher demographic of having your children apprehended.
Absolutely.
So, you come to a place, say you're struggling with your mental health. Yeah. That to some healthcare workers, that's a red flag. And then so they call the ministry and
yes.
And then here we are. Yeah. And then we're dealing with that.
Yeah. So that stood out to me when I was first talking to you, because my mind hadn't really got there yet. That right. If an Indigenous person accesses mental health, that they are more likely to have their children then removed. Right? So they're always weighing this, and whether like it's a systemic problem, it's there's a historical context for that of removing. There's a bad track record for removing children, and I think they're more likely to go there. So that stood out to me. So now you have the higher needs, a system that isn't working, and are more likely to take your kids. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that blew me away.
And let's be clear that counselors as well have a duty to report. Like, all like bet. Professional trained have a duty, so as soon as you're in any kind of setting where, you have to, you have a duty to report, Yes, there are times where this is necessary. However, that I'm not going to lie, that's a red flag for a lot of Native folks because of the historical treatment.
That's right. Yeah. They're more at risk. And I think as a non-Indigenous person accessing those questions wouldn't mean the same thing. I would just assume that, even though I'm having mental health struggles, I'm still, being a good parent, and they would see that. Yeah. They're not going to jump to some conclusions.
Yes.
And I don't think it's something that a counselor is going to intentionally do in most cases, but they might make that leap. So if the duty to report on me as a counselor, therapist, psychologist, I put that through my filter, right? That's a judgment call.
Yeah.
Right. And there's going to be some things that are no-brainers, whether your client's Indigenous or not.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Right. Yep. But when we're trying to figure out what our biases are, what our training has left out, what those holes are, we still need to be a little, like, our own filters need to be a little suspect. Right?
Yeah.
I became suspicious of my own filter.
Yeah. I mean, that's good.
That's good.
Good.
That's
kind of what we're trying to do.
That's what we're trying to do is we got to look at that. And if anyone else is kind of like, oh, wow, I never thought that an Indigenous client coming to see me and getting support when she's struggling and she's got babies, that that's a risk for her.
Absolutely.
That just gives me chills. Like right now, I'm like, you're desperate and you need help.
Yeah.
And yet to reach help.
I get chills too when I think about it, because I said to my husband again yesterday, I said, even when we go through hard times, we always have to remember too that we also have the privilege of going through hard times in a home, or in a setting where at least we have the privacy to go through our grief or move through whatever it is we're going through, so there are so many layers to this, Devaney. There's so many, imagine an Indigenous mother who's struggling with her housing, where she's in a place or worse in a setting of violence where she's maybe experiencing violence and there's children involved and gosh, the list goes on, right? So it's like there's a lot of layers there that people have to be aware of, and some of us have privilege, I consider myself more privileged, yes, I have those layers of intersection as well, but I also understand very clearly, what I have,
That's good. And that's the intersection, the conversations you really wanted to get to. And we can talk about a lot of cool things.
Yeah.
And I hope we will. But that's kind of the, I think one of the more important things to bring out, especially if these podcasts are used to increase awareness and to train healthcare workers, mental health, those like that. It's important to hear that.
Yeah.
So that was your first one.
Yeah.
Okay. It was quite something. I mean, we laughed.
Yeah, that was funny. I think back on it and I'm just like, does he still have that job? Like,